to, well, let me just, I'd like to move to module 1. So module 1 helps set the scene, as I said earlier on. We're going to hear 3 different perspectives on work-based assessment. We'll have a learner perspective at the end of the day, as I've said. And our first speaker is Kerstin May, and she will give a HEI perspective, or a university perspective, on work-based assessment. Kerstin is the interim president of the University of Limerick, and I would invite Professor May to give her presentation now, and you have 6 or 7 minutes. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. I'm very pleased to be at this symposium today to talk about work-based assessment. The University of Limerick has a work-based learning in its DNA. It was developed with the inception of this higher education institution, and it was one of the factors that very much attracted me to the university when I joined it in 2018, initially as Vice President Academic Affairs and Student Engagement. I would like to put my thoughts on assessment of work-based learning into a wider context. That is the strategic goals of jobs. If we look at the Irish knowledge economy and the correspondence between the graduate attributes that higher education institutions have developed, the knowledge and skills needed for the economy and the shaping force of higher education in the future agenda for jobs. The resilience and growth and competitiveness of the economy, which requires talent with the right competencies and skills and knowledge, and of course inclusion as a key issue and the work towards a fair and prosperous society. Secondly, we have to bear in mind that we are currently in a situation where we experiencing radical and rampant changes to professional fields and occupational patterns through digitization, artificial intelligence and machine learning, automation, and not least globalization, which will affect the context and concepts, forms and formats of work-based learning and how it is assessed. And therefore, there is a review required that takes into account the need for diversification and potentially change of work-based learning. And I have to confess that I actually favor the term work-integrated learning because it reflects a very different context in which professional contexts are being integrated into education. I would like to briefly talk about work-based learning. That is where the learning takes place within the workplace. And for students, and I hope students forgive me that I speak on their behalf, that requires that they are being enabled to develop their attributes towards graduate employability, that they're being enabled to apply discipline-specific knowledge in professional context, engage in real-world and active and experiential learning, acquire professional competencies in health, in teacher education, engineering, and other professionally accredited programs, and hone their transferable skills from metacognition, problem solving, teamwork, communication, but also coping with ambiguity and complexity, which is increasingly important, and have an opportunity to be empowered by identifying the gaps in their own knowledge and skills and inform their future career decisions and their learning for the future. From the HEI perspective, work-based learning is a very important part in the development of employer relations, in informing the development of our curriculum, the relevance of programs of studies and their learning objectives, and for us to also be at the table to shape the dialogue about the employability of the future. And that has to be reflected in the dialogue about the assessments of work-based learning, particularly where we may move to much more dual education modes, i.e. where you have half of the education taking place within the academic context and half within industry settings. I would like to look at assessments of, for, and as learning. Within our cooperative education, we very much use the assessment as a reflective exercise at the end of the placement experience. It is a pass-fail assessed report by the students to reflect on their learning during the placement, on the experience and on their future career choices. That allows us to also feedback to employers about the placements. There are different challenges for competency-based learning in the different areas, and we will hear about that earlier. What I wanted to highlight for us as higher education providers is the close collaboration with practitioners and supervisors in terms of informing expectations, standards, and working closely together to support the integrity of the application and expectation management on part of the students. Here, assessments are often graded on a slide of developmental, meeting competencies and exceeding competencies. But there are emerging areas that need to be looked at as well. And I would like to highlight three. First of all, that is the area of community engagement, where students, for instance, in the practicum, work in, with, and through communities to address social issues. Here we have to look at the context in which assessment takes place, particularly in terms of sensibility to power relations and others. We have to look at the different employability requirements for students and take into account that many students will engage in portfolio work and patchwork careers and need to be equipped to be self-determined learners. That means entrepreneurial approaches to work, and I call it work integrated learning here, where students develop their own projects within a professional context, need to take into account how we deal with calculated risk-taking and failure, teamwork in the assessment, and feedback in a meaningful way. And last but not least, when we look at how work-based contexts are integrated into the learning within the universities through industry projects and so on, I would like to throw up one topic here for assessment, and that is commercially sensitive information, IP. How do we deal with that, particularly in terms of assessment, making assessments available, using it for evaluations? How do we develop the relationship with the employers? To wrap up, and I would have liked to say much more, is I have a number of questions. When we look at assessments for work-based learning, besides the focus on authenticity, consistency of assessment of work-based learning, we have to continue to consider issues such as standardization of assessment as part of quality assurance and the integrity of academic awards, equivalency in order to safeguard equality of opportunity for students and fairness. We also have to take into account different literacies and develop our assessments, taking into account the opportunities of digital technologies in relation also to the capacity and capabilities of assessors in the higher education institutions, but also in our employers and professional areas. And I stop here because I'm exceeding my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kerstin. And I'd like to move on then now to our next speaker, who's Anne-Marie Ryan. Anne-Marie is the Director of Professional Standards and Education with the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Ireland, and will give a professional regulator perspective. Over to you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. I'm delighted like that to be able to join such a wonderful audience that I know we have today. And I suppose just to put a small bit of context on, I'm hoping I can share my screen. Can I? Yep. Can I share my screen, please? I suppose just to put a small bit of context on this is that nursing has been regulated since 1919, but in 1977 there was an EU directive to harmonise education across Europe so that nurses could move all around Europe. And that was in the time when nursing education was an apprenticeship type model. And within that, half of the programme had to be clinical instruction. So you can see that on this slide, that the clinical instruction there then in front of it, what was actually required. Now that actually hasn't changed since 1977. So we'll say, well, okay, well, so what, Anne-Marie? What's the thing of that? Well, the significance of that was when we went into a nurse education undergraduate degree programme in 2002 with the 13 higher education institutions that are currently offering the programme. That posed a bit of a difficulty for some of those HEIs because we had to be compliant with the directive as such, but also more specifically, so we wanted to actually move from our education programme that was syllabus driven to a terminal outcomes model based on 6 domains of competence to achieve the outcomes that you can see there on the slide, because we believed that this actually was what we needed for a registered nurse from coming out of a degree programme. So we developed these requirements and standards back in 2002. They were reviewed in 2005. And then the Department of Health actually undertook a review of the undergraduate programme back in 2012. And this was undertaken with a wide stakeholder group. There was evaluation strategy within it. It was quite a comprehensive review, in fact, at the time. But one of the findings of the review at the time was that there was a failure to fail some of the students. So within that then, one of the report recommendations that came out, and you can see sort of the most important part of it there in green, is that the board, in conjunction with the health services executive and that and the higher education institutions, would review student clinical assessment processes, including the documentation to promote standardization of clinical assessments in line with competency goals for the 4 undergraduate programs that we had. Now, the significance of this was, and why it was really important as well, is that there were clinical sites that a number of HEIs were sharing. So that if you had one particular college was using one particular site, you could have clinical staff, if they were assessing students in the clinical area, that they in fact would have maybe 2 or 3 pieces of documentation to negotiate. So this sort of caused some challenges for the regulator in relation to the assessment of clinical learning, because as you know, as I've said before, that the programme was half clinical instruction. So we really had to link work-based learning to work-based assessment. We were required then to ensure that the supports were in place for the learning and the assessment of learning. So that from the regulator's point of view, we had to be assured that the assessment of learning was there to be able to ensure that the assessment could occur. So there were structures in place, and these were put in place by the Department of Health when we set up the programme in the first place. So there were preceptors, so all staff nurses who were associated with students in the placement area, they were all trained to be preceptors, and we have a whole mechanism on how to do that. We then developed a new grade worker, which was a clinical placement coordinator with a ratio of 1 to 30 students. And they were to support students in the clinical area and ensure that the learning opportunities were there for them. We had then this other grade of practice development coordinator who oversaw the clinical placement coordinator, but also sort of ensured that there was quality learning environments, that there were correct policies, that evidence-based practice was there, that they really had this focus on quality. And then there was the linked lectures, of course. The standards then of NMBI that I sort of referred to earlier, they state what supports should be in the clinical environment to meet the assessment of competence. And we are required then by our legislation to do site inspections every 5 years. So as part of this, we need now to explore how competence is measured and by who, how issues are dealt with in the clinical area, how issues are escalated, how students can appeal an issue, how the resolution of differences can be achieved in partnership between the HEI and the health services provider. Because for successful work-based learning and assessment requires an investment in all of these things, and this is really what we are trying to measure when we go in on our clinical site visits. So just to show, well, what did we do in order to address that finding that the Department of Health had in 2012. So as part of the implementation process of those findings, NMBI, in partnership with with the HEIs, with 13 HEIs, having a steering committee, they developed these particular tools based on 4 principles. That the response scale is that the student is competent or not competent. So the competence is either achieved or it's not achieved. That judgments rather than objective observations are sought. That the assessment should focus on competencies that are central to the activity being observed. And that the assessors who are best placed to judge performance are actually the preceptors, the people who are on the ground. So we developed these tools. These tools were shared with all the HEIs, and each one of the HEIs has adapted these for their own purposes. That's to include their own logos, their local rules and procedures, and all of those sort of other good things that need to be within their own systems. So these are available to anybody. We don't have them actually on our website, but if anybody would like them, we'd be happy to share them with you. So in real terms, how does this work from year 1 to year 4? So from the preceptor or the mentors through 3 structured meetings during the duration of a clinical placement, they will identify and assess where the student is within this trajectory. As I say, we have these particular scales. Benner is one that we use within nursing, and like that, Benner's seminal work was from 1984, but it looks about looking at a person as being a novice, being an advanced beginner, and then becoming competent. We also then use some Steinecker and Bell's level of scale, and also then what type of supervision is required of the student. And at the end of the 4-year program, the students actually have to work under distance supervision, where they are required to internalize and disseminate their information. So the biggest challenge for us then as the regulator is can we keep up with all the scientific and technical advancements that are required within service using an old directive. So as I say, we're looking at chronic disease management, we're looking at new models of care, of how healthcare is being delivered. So these are the challenges that our health service providers and our HEIs are dealing with at the moment, and that we as the regulator need to be responsive to. So thank you, Peter. I hope I haven't taken my time.
Certainly not. Thanks very much, Anne-Marie. That was fascinating. And we'll move on now to our third perspective, and this one is from Claire McGee. She's Head of Education and Innovation Policy for IBEC, and Claire will give us an employer perspective. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you here this morning. I find this whole topic actually incredibly interesting. I think both all our opening speakers and in particular Professor May really highlighted, I think, that the opportunity for Ireland within work-based assessment, work-based learning, and I wholeheartedly agree that maybe we need to be moving towards a more inclusive concept around work integrated assessment and learning. So the perspective I think I'd like to share with you this morning is perhaps, why is this important, obviously, for industry? What are some of the challenges, and how can industry and education and I suppose the broader system work in partnership together to try and deliver, I suppose, common outcomes, common goals? So just putting the industry perspective on it, industry is now one of Ireland's kind of largest incubators of talent, let's just say, and they can do that through kind of 4 means. And now people are talking about it, the industrial kind of 4 Bs when it comes to recruiting people into the organisation. They either buy it in, so that's through their traditional recruitment and hiring practices. They build it, so they train their own and they implement their own internal learning and development strategy. They borrow that talent, so they outsource maybe a specific task. Or thirdly, they bridge maybe with other organisations through collaborations. But actually, when I look at kind of work-based assessment and work-integrated learning, I see that maybe it's a case that this is actually a concept of all 4 of those different Bs, where industry and education providers can actually work together to deliver those common outcomes. So a little over 2 years ago, maybe it's just under 2 years ago, I worked with my colleagues in IBEC to develop our Smarter World, Smarter Work campaign. And that campaign was really around, I suppose, us providing some input into this kind of global conversation around the future of work. And as part of that, I developed a series of policy recommendations. around improving graduate employability skills. And I'm very happy to circulate that document maybe after this. But actually it speaks to around enhancing employability skills for graduates, but also how do we kind of connect industry, business and the education institution closer together to kind of help people transition in and out of work that little bit easier. Because of the one thing we know, there's no more that traditional job for life. You may join an organization when you graduate, but actually you'll probably have multiple careers within that organization. Or indeed, you'll join an organization, stay with them for a couple of years, and then transition into different industry sectors or different careers. So our aim with these set of guidelines was really around developing those kind of key employability skills couched around personal leadership. So that kind of self-motivation, self-awareness, building your own curiosity, creativity, your capacity to make things happen. So that entrepreneurial mindset that Kerstin spoke about. Also about kind of marrying that then with the subject knowledge. And understanding around how you apply that subject knowledge, so around communication, literacy, logical and analytical reason. And then finally, the third kind of piece of that jigsaw is around business acumen and understanding, I suppose, business or customer awareness, creative problem solving, networking, team working and collaboration, and how that all works together. Our aim with that was ultimately to really help the student to become that self-reflective practitioner. So therefore, that when they actually transition full-time into the workplace, they kind of have built those positive habits that maybe work-based assessment can help them. So help them unlock their learning, maybe when they return back into the institution after having a period of time, maybe on work placement. One thing that was really important, I think, from Geraldine's slides that I really want to pick up on is that huge continuum of work-based learning and integrated learning as well. And it comes really from that very kind of formal, highly regulated clinical placement that Anne-Marie just spoke about, right through to, you know, apprenticeship, traineeship, workplace project work, hackathons, and different things like that. So we mustn't forget that there's a huge spectrum here, and that probably creates multiple challenges, not only just for yourselves within the institutions and how you assess that, but also for the students in terms of identifying what's the best opportunity for that. The benefits for industry, and I think we must also reflect on this a little bit. Obviously, it helps them identify a more sustainable, stable talent pipeline that ultimately it can create a more diverse talent pipeline for them as well. It can help narrow the skills gap. And that's actually something we need to be very conscious of over the next little while because of rising youth unemployment levels coming out of the pandemic. We need to be very careful that we're not allocating people just into jobs to get them into jobs, that we're actually being very kind of targeted in our labour activation measures and our activation supports to making sure that we're allocating people into the right areas for them and also again for our economy and for our society. So it's about really making sure that people are kind of working together, because while it might be a short-term measure just to get people into jobs right now, that will have major implications for our economy and our society in about 2 or 3 years' time. So really kind of tightening that gap between supply and demand around education. So there's some, obviously as well, there's great opportunity to increase productivity and innovation levels because you keep that loop open between the workplace, the industry, and then the institution. And I think that's always a really positive thing. But one thing I want to kind of wrap up on before I finish my points here and we can have some Q&A, the challenge in getting employers involved. And that's something that's not like, I don't take lightly, and I appreciate it is a major challenge because education delivery is not their core business. But ultimately, if you want to build those deeper partnerships, it's about engaging with industry as early as we possibly can, so that actually it can be kind of, rather than shoehorning industry at the very end when you have to find work placement or an opportunity to manage that assessment, it has to be born up from the very beginning. The other thing I'd like to mention is, let's not forget about SMEs in Ireland and the potential to do work-based assessment with SMEs. It's very easy to kind of fall into I suppose, the safe zone where we know that larger companies have the capacity to actually do some of that more, I suppose, formal work-based assessment. but there's huge opportunity within our SME base. The profile of SME is changing in Ireland as well. There's some great innovative companies out there, but they really need the skill set that are coming from the institutions at the moment, particularly with the pace of change that they're trying to deal with. So I'd kind of really implore maybe some of the career service practitioners who may be in the audience today to really reflect on that and to think about, is there an opportunity there with a lot of our SMEs to support kind of getting young people, getting this skill set that they so desperately need into their businesses to help them to grow for the future. I'll leave it there because I'm sure there's plenty of good questions coming from the audience, but delighted to be able to participate on this module this morning. I think it's an incredibly important one. The policy, obviously the National Skills Strategy sets out this policy. It's quite ambitious, but let's try and work together with enterprise, with industry, to be able to identify more opportunities across that continuum to help young people kind of transition into the world of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire.